Corn farmers are getting hit 3 times harder. We are talking $273.71 lost on every single acre of corn, according to brand new data from the University of Arkansas that just dropped in October 2025. Let me put that in real numbers for you. If you have a 500-acre corn farm, that is $137,000 in losses this year. If you have 1,000 acres, you are down $273,710. This is not some projection or estimate. This is what is actually happening right now across Arkansas. The University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture just released their analysis called The State of the Arkansas Crop Economy in 2025, and the numbers are absolutely devastating. Their economists Hunter Byram, Ryan Loy, and Scott Stiles crunched all the data: expected yield, expected price, revenues, operating costs, rent, and corn came out as the second worst crop in the entire state. Only cotton is doing worse, at $352 per acre lost. Think about that for a second. Soybeans are losing $85 per acre, and farmers are going under from that. Rice is losing $258 per acre, and that industry is collapsing. But corn is losing $273.71 per acre. It is a complete bloodbath.
Soybeans were once the pride of American farming, the crop that fed economies and filled bank accounts across the Midwest. Today, that story has flipped. Exports to China, the single largest customer, have collapsed by 77%. Futures that were soaring not long ago are now nearly 40% below their 3-year high. And in towns built on agriculture, silos are stacked to the brim with unsold beans, forcing farmers to take losses they can't afford. What used to be a dependable cash crop has turned into a heavy weight, dragging the industry down. The silence from Beijing is louder than any deal ever signed. With 0 new orders placed this year, the question grows harder to ignore. Has America's so-called green gold already been stripped of its value? And if the world's biggest market is closing its doors, where does the American farmer turn next? The figures on trade charts only hint at the damage. The real toll is written across farm country, where every missed payment and every acre harvested at a loss weighs heavier than any statistic could capture. Farmers across the Midwest aren't tracking percentages on spreadsheets. They are deciding which bills can wait, which equipment can survive another season without repair, and whether their families can hold on to the land passed down for generations. Soybean futures hover near $10 a bushel, when the average cost of production runs closer to $11. On paper, the gap looks small. Spread across hundreds or thousands of acres, it drains entire incomes and forces producers deeper into debt. Caleb Ragland, president of the American Soybean Association, disclosed that his own farm has already taken on losses of nearly $750,000, and that the only way forward was to borrow more in the hope of surviving the storm. His story is far from unique.
This is a 24-hour job, so I need people who are willing to work in shifts at different times of the day.
But it's hard to find those people.
Yeah.
In 2024, over 200 family farms filed for bankruptcy, a 55% jump from the year before.
What if I told you that one decision, made thousands of miles away from Washington, just erased $12 billion from the U.S. economy? What if I told you that America's agricultural giants, those billion-dollar corporations that have dominated global markets for decades, just faced the kind of rejection they never saw coming? And it came from Africa? Because for the first time in modern history, multiple African nations, backed by regional blocs, new trade alliances, and rapidly rising domestic industries, have collectively said no to U.S. agricultural imports. No corn, no soybeans, no wheat, no processed agricultural goods. A total shutdown of products that once dominated African supermarkets. And the shockwave has been immediate. Billions wiped out. Cargo ships redirected. Contracts canceled overnight. And American farmers, already struggling, are now facing their worst crisis in over 20 years. But here's the part Washington absolutely did not expect. Africa didn't reject U.S. agriculture out of anger. It didn't happen because of politics. It didn't happen because of sanctions. It happened because Africa is rising. Nations like Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, Ghana, Tanzania, and Algeria are transforming their food production industries, building processing plants, strengthening local agriculture, and forming new multi-billion-dollar partnerships with emerging global players like China, Brazil, India, Turkey, and the UAE. For the first time ever, Africa is choosing its own path. And that path no longer leads through American agricultural dominance. And the US is panicking. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings are happening. Lobbyists are pouring millions into Washington. Agricultural giants like Cargill, ADM, and Bunge are facing investor pressure they never expected. Because Africa wasn't supposed to do this. For decades, Africa was seen as America's guaranteed market, a place that would always import U.S. food, U.S. grain, U.S. processed products, a market U.S. corporations believed they controlled. But today, everything has changed. Africa has new alliances, new trade partners, new priorities, and a new level of confidence. And the U.S. suddenly realizes it can't bully, pressure, or manipulate its way back into the African market anymore. Not when Africa has alternatives. Not when Africa has power. Not when Africa is finally becoming a global economic force. But here's the twist. The real crisis for America isn't just the $12 billion loss. It isn't the canceled contracts. It isn't the collapsing farm exports. It's the fear that Africa's rejection could trigger a global realignment, a domino effect where more countries follow Africa's lead, hurting U.S. dominance even further. Because Africa is not just a market. It's the future, the fastest growing population, the fastest growing urbanization rate, the next major global consumer base, the next global industrial zone. The world's largest untapped agricultural frontier and a continent every major power wants to partner with. The U.S. knows the truth. If it loses Africa, it could lose its position in global trade. And this agricultural crisis is only the beginning. Today, you're about to understand how Africa's rejection happened, why it happened now, who helped Africa break free from U.S. dependence, and why Washington is terrified this will spread to other sectors, because what's happening right now is bigger than agriculture, bigger than trade, bigger than economics. This is the moment Africa flips the script on decades of global imbalance. This is the moment America finally sees the consequences of ignoring Africa's rise. This is the moment the world realizes Africa is no longer begging for a seat at the table. Africa is building its own table. So sit tight, because the story you're about to hear isn't just news. It's the beginning of a global power shift. And America? America never saw this coming. In a world already shaken by supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and rising global inflation, no one expected the next major economic shock to come from Africa, and certainly not from the world of agriculture. But here we are. A decision made quietly by African governments has just triggered one of the largest agricultural losses in recent U.S. history, a staggering $12 billion crash across American food export markets. It all began when several African nations simultaneously restricted, suspended, or redirected imports of key U.S. agricultural products, including corn, soybeans, wheat, poultry, and processed foods. This wasn't just one country taking a stand. It was a continental shift, a coordinated economic decision, a signal that Africa is no longer willing to be dependent on U.S. agricultural imports. And within weeks, American markets felt the blow. Grain exporters saw contracts canceled. Shipping companies scrambled to reroute exports. Farm states like Iowa, Nebraska, and Illinois reported massive price drops. The United States was stunned. Analysts were confused. But the truth was simple. Africa was no longer buying what America was selling. And this wasn't coincidence. This was strategy. This was policy. This was Africa rewriting the rules of global trade. In this documentary, we'll uncover why Africa made this monumental decision, how the U.S. agricultural sector became so vulnerable, and what this means for the future of global economic power, because this $12 billion crash is not just a story about food. It's a story about control, influence, independence, and the future of a rising African continent. For decades, African markets were filled with subsidized American agricultural products. Cheap U.S. grains, cheap poultry, cheap soy. This flood of artificially affordable food often crushed local African farmers who simply could not compete with U.S. government-subsidized products. African governments complained. Economists warned. Local producers protested. But nothing changed until now. In 2025, African nations began implementing food sovereignty policies designed to strengthen local food production, reduce import dependence, protect African farmers, build regional agricultural supply chains. The message was clear. Africa wants to feed itself, not depend on American farms. New import standards were introduced. Stricter quality controls, higher local content requirements, tariffs on subsidized goods, shifts toward intra-African sourcing. Suddenly, U.S. agricultural exporters found themselves shut out. And the irony? Africa was finally doing what U.S. politicians had urged their own country to do for years, bringing production back home. American farmers, once assured of guaranteed African markets, were now panicking. Washington was scrambling, but Africa wasn't backing down. Because for the first time in history, the continent held the leverage. The impact inside America was devastating and fast. Within a month, corn futures plunged, soybean prices crashed, poultry shipments were halted, U.S. export inventories piled up. With nowhere to go, farmers in the Midwest saw millions evaporate. Export companies lost contracts overnight. Politicians faced angry agricultural lobbies demanding answers. The $12 billion loss became a flashpoint in U.S. political debates. Some blamed Africa. Others blamed China. Others blamed Washington's failure to diversify markets. But the truth was unavoidable. The U.S. had underestimated Africa's economic power. For decades, American trade policy treated African markets as disposable, a place to dump excess grain and cheap food. But Africa has changed. Africa has grown stronger. Africa has choices. And now the U.S. is paying the price. Economists warn that this could be the beginning of a long-term trend, one where Africa becomes a global agricultural competitor rather than a perpetual customer. And for the United States, that reality is terrifying. Africa's rejection of U.S. agricultural imports represents something far bigger than a trade dispute. It represents economic independence, local empowerment, continental unity, strategic sovereignty, the end of Western agricultural dominance. African nations are investing heavily in irrigation, fertilizer production, mechanized farming, youth agricultural programs, AFCFTA food corridors, regional grain reserves. The goal? Feed 1.4 billion Africans using African farms, not American ones. And in the process, the continent is becoming one of the world's most powerful agricultural players. Meanwhile, the U.S. agricultural system, once the world's unbeatable giant, is now vulnerable, exposed, and forced to rethink its dependence on African markets. What does this mean for the future? A world where African demand shapes global supply. A world where African markets decide global prices. A world where Africa is no longer the customer, but a global agricultural superpower. And that world has already begun. As we close this documentary, one truth stands taller than everything we've discussed. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to shape its future. For decades, experts, economists, and global superpowers assumed the continent would remain dependent, vulnerable, and predictable. They assumed Africa would continue accepting agricultural imports, foreign-imposed trade terms, and one-sided deals that benefited everyone except Africans. But this $12 billion rejection of U.S. agricultural products proves something the world is still struggling to accept. Africa has entered a new era, one driven by self-reliance, strategic alliances, and economic courage. This was not a protest. This was not a temporary decision. This was not a political gesture. This was a message to Washington, a message to Europe, a message to global corporations, a message to every nation that once dictated African trade policy. And that message is simple. Africa is rising, and you can't stop it. Because for the first time in modern history, African nations are choosing local farmers over foreign suppliers. African markets are choosing regional trade over dependency. African governments are choosing sovereignty over pressure. African youth are choosing innovation over limitation. African investors are choosing African industries over Western imports. And the United States felt that shift hard.